Mark Zuckerberg. How a Harvard student built a $220 billion empire. In 2010, Time magazine named him Person of the Year. In 2012, at age 28, he led what was then the largest technology IPO in history. Today, his net worth is estimated at roughly $220 billion, and the platforms he controls are used by more than 4 billion people every month, roughly half the population of the entire planet. And this story didn't start with a brilliant business plan. It started with a website Zuckerberg built in a single night to rate the appearance of Harvard female students, a website that nearly got him expelled from college. Today, we're covering the complete story of Mark Zuckerberg, from a childhood obsession with programming to turning Facebook into Meta, all the way up to what's happening with the company right now, in 2026. Childhood and his first programs. Mark Zuckerberg was born on May 14, 1984, in White Plains, New York, to a dentist and a psychiatrist. His interest in programming showed up unusually early. At age 12, he wrote his own messaging program for the family network, jokingly calling it ZookNet. His father could use it, for example, to let the household know a patient had arrived, without shouting through the house. In high school, while attending the private Phillips Exeter Academy, he and a friend built a program called Synapse, a music player that used algorithms to track a user's listening habits and build a playlist matching their taste, essentially an early version of what Spotify's algorithms do today. The program caught the attention of major companies, including Microsoft and AOL, both of which offered to buy it and hire Zuckerberg himself. But he turned down both offers and chose to go to college instead. We've covered the young programmer's early years, but the real story begins at Harvard, and its first chapter nearly got Zuckerberg expelled. FaceMash, the scandal that started it all. In the fall of 2003, as a Harvard freshman, Zuckerberg built a website called FaceMash in a single night. The idea was simple and fairly cynical. The site pulled photos of female students from Harvard's internal dorm databases after hacking into the university's servers and asked visitors to vote on which of two women was more attractive, a concept borrowed from the site Hot or Not. The site racked up 22,000 views within just a few hours of launching, triggering outrage from students and university administrators alike. Zuckerberg faced possible expulsion for violating data privacy, breaching copyright, and hacking into university security systems. But the university board ultimately settled for putting him on academic probation. This scandalous but technically impressive project unexpectedly caught the attention of three Harvard upperclassmen, twins Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, and their partner Divya Narendra, who were working on their own student social network project called Harvard Connection. We've covered the FaceMash scandal, but it's precisely after this scandal that the story begins that would later turn into one of the loudest legal disputes in Silicon Valley history. Meeting the Winklevoss twins and the birth of Facebook. The Winklevoss twins and Narendra invited Zuckerberg to help program their Harvard Connection project, a site meant to connect Harvard students in a closed social network. Zuckerberg agreed to help, but according to the Winklevoss twins themselves, he dragged his feet on their project while secretly building his own, remarkably similar platform on the side. On February 4, 2004, from his dorm room, Zuckerberg, along with roommates Dustin Moskovitz and Chris Hughes, and classmate Eduardo Saverin, who funded the initial costs, launched a site called thefacebook.com. Access was initially limited to Harvard students, but by the end of that same month, the site had spread to other Ivy League universities, and by December 2004, it already had around 1 million registered users. When the Winklevoss twins learned of the launch of an almost identical service, they accused Zuckerberg of stealing their concept and filed a lawsuit. The dispute was ultimately settled in 2008 for roughly $65 million, including cash and stock, though the twins later claimed the real value of the settlement had been understated at the time of payment and tried to reopen the case for a larger sum, unsuccessfully. We've covered the conflict with the Winklevoss twins, but there was another, far more personal legal dispute, because it involved not distant classmates, but Zuckerberg's closest friend and business partner. The conflict with Eduardo Saverin. Eduardo Saverin, Zuckerberg's roommate and close friend, initially put in his own money and received a stake in the company as a co-founder. But as Facebook moved to Silicon Valley and raised venture funding, Saverin's stake was sharply diluted through a restructuring of the company's equity, dropping from roughly 30% originally down to a stake of around 1%, while he remained in New York, continuing his studies rather than working directly on the product in California alongside the rest of the team. Saverin filed a lawsuit against the company, and the dispute was settled privately on undisclosed terms. But an important outcome of that settlement was that Saverin officially retained his status as a Facebook co-founder, and his name remains officially listed in the company's records to this day. We've covered the founder's internal conflicts, but for the company to grow to the scale that would later be worth fighting over in court, it needed money. And that's where one of Silicon Valley's most famous investors enters the story. Early investment and the move to California. In the summer of 2004, Zuckerberg made a decision that shaped the rest of his life. He dropped out of Harvard and moved to Palo Alto, California, to focus entirely on growing the Facebook.com. That fall, venture investor and PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel invested $500,000 in the company in exchange for a stake of 10.2%, the first major outside investment in the company's history. Other investments followed quickly, including funding from Excel Partners worth roughly $12.7 million. By 2006, the company had grown so much that internet giant Yahoo offered to buy the entire service for $1 billion, a colossal sum at the time for a company founded by a college student just 2 years earlier. Zuckerberg turned down the offer, convinced the company's potential was far greater, a decision many people at the time considered extremely risky, even reckless. We've covered the early growth years and the first major rejected buyout offer. The next decade would turn that bet into one of the most successful in business history. Growth, the IPO, and the biggest acquisitions in social media history. By 2010, Facebook had roughly 500 million users worldwide, and that same year Time magazine named Zuckerberg Person of the Year, an unusual honor for a 26-year-old entrepreneur. On May 18, 2012, Facebook held its initial public offering at a valuation of roughly $104 billion, at the time, the largest technology IPO in history. The very next day after that historic stock offering, Zuckerberg married his longtime girlfriend Priscilla Chan, whom he'd been dating for 9 years since their time at Harvard together. The wedding timing had more to do with her finishing medical school the week before than with the IPO itself. That same year, Facebook acquired the photo app Instagram, which had roughly 30 million users at the time, for just $1 billion, a deal many critics called overpaying for an app with no revenue. Today, analysts estimate Instagram alone generates between $60 and $70 billion in annual advertising revenue, making that purchase one of the most successful acquisitions in the history of the tech industry. In 2014, an even bigger purchase followed. The messaging app WhatsApp was acquired for $19 billion, a sum that seemed almost unbelievable at the time for an app without any significant advertising model of its own. We've covered the company's biggest acquisitions, but not everything in Facebook's story was a story of triumph. And the next chapter became the most serious reputational crisis in the company's entire history. The Cambridge Analytica scandal. In 2018, the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke. It emerged that the personal data of tens of millions of Facebook users have been obtained and used without clear consent to build political profiles and target advertising during election campaigns. The scandal triggered a wave of regulatory investigations worldwide, a sharp drop in the company's stock price, and public hearings before the U.S. Congress, where Zuckerberg's reserved, tightly controlled communication style itself became the subject of countless memes and public discussion. The stock drop temporarily wiped out billions of dollars from Zuckerberg's personal fortune, and by 2022 he'd fallen from 3rd place to 13th on the list of the world's wealthiest people, amid a broader tech sector downturn and the fallout from the scandal. The legal case tied to Cambridge Analytica dragged on for years and was finally settled only in July 2025. We've covered the company's biggest crisis, but it was precisely after this crisis that Zuckerberg made a decision many saw as an attempt to completely reinvent the company itself. The rename to Meta and the Metaverse bet. In October 2021, Facebook officially changed its corporate name to Meta Platforms, signaling a strategic pivot toward virtual and augmented reality, a concept Zuckerberg himself called the Metaverse. The company's stock ticker changed from FB to Meta in June 2022. The bet turned out to be extremely costly. Reality Labs, the division responsible for VR technology, posted losses of $13.7 billion in 2022 and another $16.1 billion the following year. By 2024, the company's stock had recovered, and Zuckerberg's personal fortune once again topped $170 billion, putting him back in the top 10 wealthiest people on the planet. At the same time, the company began shifting focus away from the pure metaverse project and toward artificial intelligence. We've covered the costly metaverse bet. Now to what's happening with the company and with Zuckerberg himself right now in the most recent months. AI, politics, and where things stand today. In early 2025, Zuckerberg announced a shift in the company's focus from virtual reality to artificial intelligence, unveiling a new division called Meta Superintelligence Labs and promising to invest enormous sums into AI development over the course of a year. In April 2026, that division released its first AI model, called Muse Spark, and the company has continued ramping up investment in this area, including building massive data centers to train AI models. At the same time, Zuckerberg has visibly grown closer to the Trump administration. He attended the inauguration, dined at the Mar-a-Lago residence, and donated $1 million to the inaugural fund, a move many observers saw as an attempt to shield the company from antitrust pressure, though Zuckerberg himself insists his position remains politically neutral. In 2026, he was appointed to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. As of today, by various estimates, Zuckerberg's personal net worth ranges from $220 to $229 billion, consistently keeping him among the 5 wealthiest people on the planet. One important structural detail: thanks to a dual-class share system, Zuckerberg owns only around 13% of the company itself, but controls more than half of all shareholder voting power, meaning he retains near absolute control over Meta's strategy despite a relatively small ownership stake. Conclusion: Zuckerberg's story is the story of a student who started with a website that nearly cost him his place at Harvard, went through lawsuits from former friends and partners, turned down a billion-dollar buyout when everyone around him advised taking it, survived the biggest reputational scandal in his company's history, lost, and then recovered tens of billions of dollars in personal wealth, and, over the course of his career, completely reinvented his company's direction twice. First with the metaverse bet, and then with the pivot to artificial intelligence. Back in 2004, Zuckerberg announced his intention to donate 99% of his Facebook shares to charitable causes during his lifetime, a commitment he made long before the company reached anywhere near its current scale. How this story develops from here, given the bet on artificial intelligence and the growing closeness to political power, is a question we'll likely get an answer to within the next few years. If this was useful, subscribe. More stories of the people who built the biggest tech companies of our time are coming next. This channel is for educational purposes only. We share research and biographical information, not financial advice. We're not responsible for any decisions made based on this content.